So this is about a year old. If you were with us last year, we discussed one big topic for the whole year, and that was Christology, who is Jesus Christ. This year we're going to focus on two different topics. In the fall we're going to talk about the incarnation, and in the spring we're going to talk about the resurrection. So this is just an introduction to the incarnation. We're going to bring up a lot of issues in what we might call systematic theology that we'll be discussing over the rest of the semester, but every week we're going to have a different approach. So there's actually a slight change to the schedule. I can't make it next week. I'll be out of town, but I think, so next week will be a bit up in the air. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen. We'll come up with something over the course of the next week. But the week after that, we'll start by looking at really the world behind the Old Testament, the world before the ancient Israelites started to think about how God related to stuff. So we're going to actually look at the ancient Babylonians, the Mesopotamians, Sumerians, and so on, and the Egyptians. And we're going to actually look at some ancient theologies of creation to set what the Israelites are doing in relief. The week after that, we'll talk about the Old Testament, in particular Genesis 1 and 2, the creation stories, but also there's about 7 or so different creation stories in the Old Testament, including Proverbs 8, where woman wisdom is helping to create. And all of them are a bit different, so we're going to discuss several of those creation stories and see how the ancient Israelites were conceiving of how their God relates to stuff. But also we're going to tell a bit of the story of the development in ancient Israel of the idea of God. They don't have the same conception of God throughout their entire history. Their idea of God changes. And a big part of what changes as well is where do you find God? How does God work? So we'll get to that in a bit. So then we'll look at the New Testament. We'll spend a week with the incarnation stories in the birth of Christ, so the gospel narratives. We'll look at Mark, which of course famously doesn't have a story of Jesus' birth. We'll look at Matthew and Luke, which have the two different but usually intertwined or synthesized creation stories or birth stories that we'll hear about a lot in the course of this semester in the church's celebration of Advent and the Christmas season. And then we'll also discuss John 1, which has not really a birth story, but really more of an incarnation story, which has a slightly different sort of cosmic way of talking about Jesus and his relation to the world. So then we'll shift to Paul, and we'll spend a week thinking about Paul's letters. And Paul actually has a different theology than the Gospels in some ways. They're not at odds with one another necessarily. There are points at which there's significant tension between Paul and the Gospels. One of them being that Paul doesn't actually talk about Jesus' life very much. There's only a few episodes of Jesus' life that Paul ever mentions. Number 1 being his death and resurrection. Number 2 being his celebration of the Eucharist. But there's really only, if you think about the letters of Paul in Romans, he doesn't talk about Jesus healing in particular stories, right? When he heals Peter's mother-in-law. You think Paul would think that was a really cool thing, but he never actually mentions it. So, in any event, Paul has a slightly different way of thinking about who Jesus is and what the incarnation means, which I think enriches and deepens our theology of the incarnation. And then Paul's followers, he writes some letters in the name of Paul, which is an ancient practice. So the letter of Colossians is probably not written by Paul himself, it's written in the name of Paul by some of his disciples. And that has a slightly different, much more cosmic, sort of maybe influenced by some of the theology that's going on in the book of John. And so we'll see this development in early Christian thought through the New Testament of how the incarnation is understood. We'll then move into some other topics and talk about the incarnation in liturgy, the incarnation in the arts, the incarnation in view of modern science, the incarnation in view of questions about gender and sexuality, the incarnation in terms of race. What race was Jesus? Does race matter? The incarnation, does race exist at all? These will be questions that we address in this class. And by the end of the semester, we'll end up talking about the season of Advent to kind of lead us into the Christmas season. So that's my plan for the semester. Are there topics that you all, and I'm planning to address cosmology as well, like the origins of the universe and incarnation, and also biological evolution. So, I mean, and when I say that, I mean really with actual science. So some actual scientists, and not like Bible people like me who like dabble in science. There's some actual real scientists who have taken seriously thinking about how to not give up anything from science, but how to interpret some of the Christian claims to say the incarnation in light of actual science. So there's Celia Dean Drummond is a great example of this. She's a professor at Notre Dame. She's an actual scientist who then later in life became a theologian, actually got a doctorate in theology. after her doctorate in science. And so I had started to think about what the cosmos, what our knowledge now of the cosmos might make us rethink about Christian theology. Then there are also evolutionary biologists who have started to use actual evolutionary biology that is not like, sort of Christianizing evolutionary biology, just taking it for what it is, and then asking what that makes us think about Jesus. So for example, the fact that every human, every person in this room doesn't just have Homo sapiens DNA. We have the DNA of several different species of animals, including Neanderthal humans, but also other species of animals. DNA is in our bodies, so if Christ becomes human, Christ becomes more than human. So what does that do to us? So anyway, just thinking through some of the theological ramifications of actual science that we know today will be a topic of this class as well. Are there other things that you all think about with incarnation that you'd like to put on the agenda? The syllabus is open to be changed, and in fact, it's already been changed from what's in the racks in the fellowship. Also, I'll have to, or in the narthex, I'll have to reprint those and put them back out. But any other thoughts or things that you all want to address?
You are intending to cover life, the universe, and everything?
Yeah. No, 42 is the answer, by the way. So in any event, yeah, if there's anything else you all think about, feel free to email me. You can just Google my name, Brennan Breed, on the internet. You can find my email at my school, at Columbia Theological Seminary, just down the road. And feel free to just contact me and ask me, or if you have questions about things that I bring up in class. Let's say I say something that makes you upset, or worried, or very happy, feel free to email me and just let me know. Or if you want more to read, there's always more to read about everything. So in any event, I'm never shy to give you things to read. On the syllabus, which you can find, I meant to bring them in here, but you can find copies of it in the narthex on the rack, where lots of different handouts are provided. There's an actual syllabus with readings, not for this week, but starting for next week, and they're all online. Some of them are New York Times articles, some of them are links to papers that people have posted on their personal websites, scholars that have now started posting more of their work online. So anyway, some of those things are things you can read. Feel free to read them. You don't have to, of course, but I'm always pleased if you read those things, then you or listen. There's some lectures actually I put on there too, YouTube links, or links to podcasts. If you listen to some of those things or read some of those things before you come in, usually you'll get a lot more out of what I'm presenting than if you don't. But again, if you just want to show up, that's fine too. Now that I've introduced myself and what we are doing and what we're all about here, let me open us in prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your presence, whatever that means and however we may experience it. We thank you that we hear so many times throughout Scripture that you are here, you are with us, you are present. We thank you that you have not abandoned this world of stuff. We thank you that you haven't looked at it and said, that's pretty disgusting, and backed away. God, there are times where we, I'm sure all of us, would like to abandon some of the things in this world. We thank you that one of the promises that we hear again and again in your Scripture is that you have not let us be forsaken, that you have not abandoned us forever. God, we pray that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear you at work in this world around us. Help us to sense your presence. And as always, grant us your peace, but also your courage to help this world become something more like what you want it to be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we start with this pink tinted screen. I'm sorry, we're trying to. There's something with the projector itself that has a problem. It's not the bulb, I think, but things will be tinted pink on my screen or not. So sorry. Anyway, but this is a little picture of a baby. When Christians talk about the incarnation, usually we begin by thinking immediately of Jesus and Jesus' birth. Of course, that's central to the notion of the incarnation for Christianity. But what I want to do is back up a bit and think more broadly about the relationship between God and stuff. That is, the stuff of this world. Right? There's lots of different ways that we can imagine how God, a being of spirit, or maybe not a being, the thing that creates being itself, whatever, these complicated philosophical concepts. But however God, or the divine world, the spirit world, whatever, relates to this world of material stuff. And when we talk about incarnation, usually we talk about the words that make up this word. The Latin word carne, or flesh. And the preposition in English is the same one, in. So in flesh, or infleshment. God being put into flesh is how incarnation is understood in the Christian tradition. But again, this presumes an idea that God wasn't in flesh, God didn't have something to do with flesh, and that God became a part of flesh. So let's talk about this idea of God and stuff. So there's a general basic idea of how God relates to the world in Christian tradition, and in many other traditions too. I'd say the Abrahamic faith, so in Judaism and in Islam, there's this general understanding that God has created the world, and it's something apart from God, and God stands outside of it and above it or beyond it. So that God creates the world but remains outside of it primarily. God is, if you're going to access God, you're not going to find God primarily in this world. Maybe God appears in this world, but like the real center of God's presence is somewhere outside, beyond, above, so on. So you get this medieval picture. This is from a medieval Bible of Moralizé, so the Moralized Bible. This is one of the frontispieces of one of them. It's a beautiful picture. It's not tinted pink, you can see it in a bit more detail. But here's God pictured as Jesus, because in the medieval period, if you're going to draw a picture of God, you've got to draw a picture of Jesus, because God is unimaginable except in the person of Jesus. So for Christians, the incarnation gives people the ability to even think about, conceive, or picture God. You might wonder, you've heard in the Ten Commandments, it says, don't have any idols or images of God, don't be graven images, right? No, Christians end up interpreting that in a very different way, because for them, Christ is the image of God. God became put into a human body, so you can picture the human body part of Jesus, right? So here's God pictured as Jesus with a giant compass drawing the world, and making the world. This is the idea that we would call classical theism. Classical in the sense that a lot of people for a long time in the Christian tradition who have had a lot of power have imaged God this way, right? So this is kind of the central or normative, not in the sense that you have to believe it. By the way, we're in a Episcopal church, you can believe whatever you want. I welcome, and I'm happy I'm not trying to push any particular belief onto you, so if you sense that, I'm really just trying to present what's kind of, when I say something normative for the Christian tradition, I'm not saying that you have to believe it or that I believe it. What I'm saying is that this is what a lot of people believe in the Christian tradition, and when you pick up a book about Christianity, you'll probably assume this, unless it's one of the other views I'm going to get to in just a moment. So, classical theism. Another way of thinking about this relationship between God and stuff is deism, right? So you've heard about the deists, right? It was a big thing about the turn of the 18th century or 19th century. That century was filled with deists. These are folks who generally believe that God made the world and then just kind of backed away. Like God made the world operate almost like a machine, turned the machine on, and then just left. And God is somewhere else and doesn't really care so much. Many of the founding, what we call founding fathers of our country, were themselves deists. They're oftentimes presented as like super solid Christians by conservative folk in our country today, but they were not. And many of them, so Thomas Jefferson thinks that God sets the world into motion, or Ben Franklin is a great example of somebody who thinks that God set the world into motion and then backed away. So that God is other than the world. Now, this type of thinking about how God relates to stuff, we generally talk about this in terms of transcendence versus immanence, right? So a transcendent thing is usually understood as something that is above and beyond and of a different order of being than the thing that is immanent or near or close to us. So, for example, a tree is immanent. I can touch it, I can smell it, I can even try to taste it. I guess some taste good, cinnamon bark or whatever, you know. So I can knock it down, I can manipulate it. Something that's transcendent is something that is beyond me. I can't engage it. One way of thinking about this is in terms of dimensions. So anyone ever read the book Flatland? Maybe it was big when I was like in 8th grade and things like this. I went to geometry for the first time. So the book Flatland is about a two-dimensional world where imagine if you are as thin as a sheet of paper and you can only see on a sheet of paper, right? So everything just appears in terms of like little chunks, like very thin chunks of space. If I, a three-dimensional being, stand on top of a sheet of paper, how would you perceive me? As two lines, my feet. You wouldn't be able to see up. You have no dimension of height if you're a two-dimensional object, right? You can just see in terms of lines. So I am standing outside of that dimension. Now, the way that we think about it in terms of transcendence is that God will be kind of outside of all dimensions. God created dimensions. You can't see God, you can't touch God, you can't taste God. God's a different type of thing. God made space and time. So God's not space. God's not in time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is that classical theism?
Classical theism, yes. That God created space and time. And again, this is typically associated with what we call Abrahamic faiths, so Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And they have this idea, it's kind of, a lot of people don't really think this through very carefully, but it's just this kind of assumed idea that God made the world and all the stuff in the world, including space and time and everything else. So God is something else. God's outside of all of that. So in other words, Augustine is a great example of this. Augustine is an early Christian theologian from North Africa. He wrote the Confessions, a great book if you ever are interested in thinking about creation and so on. Augustine's Confessions begins with his own story of how he became Christian, but then of course ends with a reflection on space and time and everything. It's really beautiful actually. But anyway, Augustine has this great quote when he became a famous teacher and a lot of his students began to ask him very tricky questions, and one of them said, "So before the creation of the world, what was God doing?" And Augustine said, "Well, I don't really know." And the person said, "Well, before the creation of space and time, where was God? What was God up to?" And Augustine said, "Well, God had this stick." And the student said, "The stick? What's the stick?" And Augustine said, "To hit people over the head who ask dumb questions like that." So Augustine just thinks, if you're thinking about outside of space and time, beyond it, you're just outside of the world that mortals understand. So Christian theologians who want to think about this difference between God who's transcendent and our immanent world, oftentimes resort to metaphor. So there's a famous theologian, early theologian, Irenaeus, who came up with a bunch of theological conceptions that we just take as sort of typical these days, but someone invented them. And Irenaeus is a hugely important 3rd century theologian one of the things he came up with was the idea that we Christians need to use metaphor to talk about God because God is so different. So the way Irenaeus says it is, God is like fire, but unlike any fire you've known. God is like love, but unlike any love you've known. God is like provision, but unlike any provision you've known. So in any event, Irenaeus kind of goes through these things and says, we always have to say that God's bigger, above, beyond, not fully captured by whatever immanent thing we're pointing to symbolize God. Yeah, Bruce.
So how does the notion that God created the world and backed away and is not in the world, how does that square with the notion that God is with us every day, that God cares about us, that God helps us or whatever? Isn't there a contradiction?
Well, so those are two different points of view, I would say. Yeah. So classical theism generally presumes that God did create the world and back away, and then that there's some reason that God needs to be involved in the world. God wants to be involved in the world. God loves the world. God wants to help the world in some way that the world doesn't understand, so God becomes involved in it in a particular way. That's classical theism. Deism is like a twist on that, where it says, yeah, just look at the world. It looks like we've been abandoned. So let's just assume. So classical theism and deism are at odds in terms of God's continuing involvement with the world. Does that make sense? Yeah, there's just two different points of view. Both of them presume the same structural relationship between God and the world. God's different, but they presume a different intentionality in terms of God's continued care. So, question?
As you divide things into transcendent and what would clouds be?
Imminent. They're above us, but still, if you get in an airplane and fly up there, you can take, like a touch a cloud, it might go right through your fingertips, but still it's a thing. We can put it in a bottle and we can study it. It'll condense and turn into water. It's H2O. Does that make sense? Like we can, even things that are, even like human love, we can still try to measure and calculate in some way. What Christians would say is that there's a transcendent element to humanity or to maybe other parts of the world, to our sense of love and wonder or whatever. It's pointing us up to God, but still that there's an immanent cause of it. It's our brains that make us have thoughts, or it's our sort of emotional nervous system that helps us to feel. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So yeah, a great question. There's ways to ask about the relationship between transcendence and immanence that we'll get to. Yeah.
You mentioned a theologian who brought the use of metaphor to bear. So
Yes.
before him, how was God described?
Oh, well, people always use metaphors, but Irenaeus ends up pointing out that metaphors. So if you read the Psalms, some of the Psalms are very ancient. Some of the Psalms go back to, sometime around the year 800 BC or something. And in the Psalms they say God is a rock. So what Irenaeus does is Irenaeus ends up saying he's trying to help us understand what we're doing when we use metaphor, but also he's there to say, but God's not like any rock. There's this, God really is beyond all that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's a development in our theology of metaphor. That's what Irenaeus helps us to do.
And maybe I'm jumping in too.
Sure.
Why did we move away from that?
From that sense of God?
God's met.
Oh, Yeah, well, I think that troubles some people. Some people want God to be more easily conceivable. Some people want God to be harder to. Yeah, what's that? Oh, yeah.
I would say,
Sure. So yeah, some people get really worried when they feel like they can't conceive of God. God's bigger than their mind. A lot of people give lip service to that. Yes, sure, God's above and beyond, but God has given us a message that's very easily containable and so on. A lot of Christians, a lot of people in general get worried when mystery is a big part of their life or their philosophy or their theology. So I'd say just worry, concern that you maybe don't have it right, or we haven't nailed it down yet, or what if it's all different than you imagine it is? That kind of stuff makes people back away from thinking that God is sort of limitless in terms of difference from us. Does that make sense? Or yeah. So in any event, there's another way of thinking about God and stuff, and you all know this from your readings when you were in high school and so on of Greek mythology, right? There's a very different way that you can think about how gods relate to stuff. That idea, instead of that God creates the world and stands outside of it, that God or the gods are just part of the world. They're just in it. They're limited. So ancient Greek myths, also ancient Near Eastern myths, the Israelites are, the Old Testament, it exists in a world where this is presumed, that there isn't some sort of God that stands outside of all of creation. So if you read ancient Eastern creation stories, which we will in just a couple weeks, you'll see that they start with this kind of like chaos. Like there's no what we call creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. That doesn't exist in the ancient world.
Say that word again.
Creatio ex nihilo. So it's a Latin phrase, it means creation from nothing. So there's no creation from nothing in the ancient world. They all presume that the gods start with like a bunch of stuff in the ancient world. This is the chaos, like the world of chaos. So the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth, which they recited every year on their New Year. And we'll be part of that next 2 weeks. And in the Enuma Elish, they say, well, when the gods kind of began to make the world, so the presumption is that the gods helped make the world. The gods are already kind of a part of this world that already exists. And they say that there's this big kind of chaos monster. And then the gods have to fight the chaos monster, and they destroy the chaos monster, and then they make a good world out of it. The people of the area where the Israelites end up developing like their religion in space and culture, they call this chaos monster Leviathan. Leviathan. That's the name of the chaos monster. So that exists in the Bible. You can read it. Leviathan is used in several Psalms. It's in the book of Job and so on. This is the chaos monster, right? So ancient Israelites deal with this idea that God is related to chaos in some way. Also in Genesis 1, God began creating the heavens and the earth. There was a deep. The Tehom is the Hebrew word that's used. We'll get to this in a couple of weeks. But there was this big deep out there. In Genesis 1, it doesn't deny that there's some sort of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, but it just starts the story with this big deep out there, the big chaos. Except, in Israelite conception, it's not a monster that's trying to kill everyone. It's clay that God's going to form into the world. So they have their own distinctive theology, but it still is not quite like what many people would presume today. So, sorry. Oh.
Say that part.
Oh, yeah, so Genesis 1, and we'll read Genesis 1 in a few weeks, so yeah, we'll get to this in detail, but God starts creating the world in Genesis 1 with the Tehom, the deep. There was a deep, right? The Spirit of God floats over that deep, and then God says, let there be light, right? So God starts the creation process with all this kind of like stuff out there, and God forms it. And so, again, the ancient Israelites just didn't think about creation from nothing. That's not saying that they didn't, like, if you would have told them about it, they might have been like, that's a cool idea. But they start their creation stories with God forming kind of inert matter into forms, like light and space and worlds and animals and plants and people. But this is part of a big, long story for them that starts with stuff. So, and where did the stuff come from? Ancient Israelites don't care. They never ask that question, they never answer it. So it's because they're ancient Eastern people, and all ancient Eastern people begin the creation stories with stuff already existing. Now, for ancient Eastern peoples, that's because the gods are part of the world. Ancient Israel is learning slowly over time. They eventually end up saying that God is outside of stuff and creates the world, and that's part of a learning process for ancient Israel. It's a long, again, we'll get to that. But they're not sure exactly how their God relates to the world of stuff at first. So, if God is a limited part of the world, like let's say the Olympian deities, right? Remember the Olympian deities, right? You know, like Zeus, like fools around, like sleeps with women who aren't his wife finds out and gets very upset, tries to kill the children, right? That Zeus has had, like Hercules sends snakes to try to get them. Now you've got like god baby things, like that are sort of human, sort of not, right? It gets really messy really quick. The gods have passions, they get angry, they don't know things, right? Zeus can be tricked, right? Zeus can trick other people, other gods. So this conception of the world is what we would generally call polytheism, or sort of, and especially ancient polytheism. The idea that the gods, and sometimes the gods are like children of each other. You know, like parent gods have kid gods. You know, Hercules is a son of Zeus. So this kind of family lineage of these gods presume that they act kind of like big, strong people. That's the ancient perception. And ancient Israel comes about in a time and a place where people pretty much assume this. The gods are real powerful, but they don't know everything. You have to tell them things. You can lie to them. They might find out that you've lied and get really mad and hurt you because they're stronger than you and really powerful, but they have limitations because they are a part of the created order. Now, who did the creation? In all those ancient creation stories, it's kind of a slippery question. There's usually some gods that are the ground of being in a way. They're the thing that ends up starting creation, but they actually kind of stand outside of it and aren't really part of it. Those chaos monsters and things. So we'll get to those in a couple weeks as well. One other typical element of these polytheistic conceptions of how God might relate to stuff, that is that the gods are just part of the world. They are made of stuff. Is maybe stronger stuff than you, but or more powerful stuff, but still stuff. There's anthropotheism. So anthropos, like human, and then theism, God. So like the gods are in the form of a human. That all of the gods look like people. People are like little tiny versions of gods. Christianity ends up actually sounding a lot more like this than you might imagine because of the incarnation, right? So Christians always have to be thinking about how does my religion relate to like the Hercules stuff, you know? Is Jesus like Hercules? And in fact, there are a lot of early Christians who have to deal with that question quite a bit because, as you imagine, there are a lot of people who believe in Greco-Roman religion at the time of Jesus, right? It's a Greco-Roman world. They're writing their New Testament in Greek. So this is something that they actually think about quite a bit. Last possible conception of how God might be a limited part, or the gods, the divine world might be a limited part of our human world, is animism. The idea that there are spirits that animate certain rocks or trees or certain sacred sites. Certain people might be filled with certain spirits of God or the divine world, and not others. Right. So this is a very common thing to find in the ancient world, and we find this in the Old Testament too. There's a great story you all remember from Sunday school many years ago that Dagon is the god of the Philistines. One of the god of the Philistines. Actually, he's a god that a lot of people had in ancient Greece. But there's the Ark of the Covenant gets put down in front of Dagon, 1 Samuel 4, and it knocks over the statue of Dagon, like this Philistine god. Dagon means wheat. Dagon was the god of wheat, and like you could picture Dagon as like a big strong guy, which they did in the ancient world. But also Dagon was just in wheat. You'd find like Dagon was the god of wheat. All wheat was called Dagon. Dagon was literally the name for wheat. My God is, like you worship the wheat god because he brings the wheat, but he's also kind of in the wheat, right? So the gods in the ancient world are considered to be kind of like in stuff that they're a part of, or that manifest them. So Baal, you might have heard Baal, right, from the Bible, right? Real God, real ancient God. Baal actually just means Lord. His real name is Hadad. Baal, Hadad, Lord Hadad. He's the storm god of the ancient peoples who live in that area of the world, in what we call the Levant, from like the people in Syria, the Arameans, all the way down to the Israelites. They all believe that there's this storm god that exists named Baal Hadad, and he flies on clouds, and whenever you see clouds go by and they drop lots of rain, Baal Hadad is in those clouds. Like Baal is in the rain because he's the storm god. He's also above and beyond the storm god, so they have a very weird conception of how gods work and how stuff works. This is because ancient Greek people don't have the same philosophical presuppositions we do about how the world works. We'll get to this in a couple of weeks. Ancient people actually think that stuff works really differently than we do. You ever read the Bible and people talk about their name? Making your name great, my name will be great. They're not just talking about their reputation, metaphorically. They're actually talking about their name. Your name, if someone curses your name, it actually does something to you. Not to your body necessarily, but your body is just one part of you. You are your name, your reputation, you're also your image. If you make an image of an ancient king, and someone else goes by and breaks off the face of it, that's not a metaphorical, dismissal of the king's power. That actually hurts the king. It doesn't hurt their body, they don't go out. But that's really a part of them. Your image is a part of you, your name is a part of you, your body is another part of you. So the ancient people actually had a very much more robust sense of what being was than we do today. Today, if you step on a picture of someone else, you're like, that's like an affront to me, or whatever. It's an insult. It wasn't an insult in the ancient world. It was understood to actually hurt the person. So they had a broader sense of what a person was. A person is their name. A person is their family. You live on through your future generations. So that's literal to them. Yeah.
We've lost some of that.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. Today we would think, if you make fun of me, sticks and stones break my bones, but words can't hurt me. In the ancient world, very much so, that words could hurt the actual you. Yeah.
Could sticks and stones hurt in the old world?
Yes, they do a lot. But think about Jacob, right? Stealing the birthright from his brother Esau and tricking Isaac. Isaac says, I'm going to give you the birthright. And then Esau comes back and says, you got the wrong guy. Jacob stole it from me. He was dressed up in weird furry costume, whatever it is. He made himself smell bad, so he smelled like me, whatever. He brought you food that I would cook. He tricked you into giving me. Those are just some words. Take them back. And Jacob says, I can't take them back. I said it. It works. It's almost like magic, right? My words are a thing that actually have already done their work, and he's got the birthright. His name has the birthright. Jacob doesn't look any different. He's now taken off his costume, right? He looks like the same old guy he looked like, but something has changed in his self, in his being. He's got the birthright now. Anyway, there's like a world of almost magic that works in the ancient world that we don't see today. And this also affects, as you might imagine, affects the way that ancient people think about gods. So, gods have human bodies in the ancient world. That's a conception that a lot of people think, but they also can be invisible. And they also can appear in their temple, in their cult statue. They can literally manifest themselves in a cult statue in their temple. So we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks too, but this idea that God is a limited part of the world is maybe more complex and maybe even more robust theologically than we might think. It's just like stupid old Greeks thinking that the gods get drunk. So, anyway, so another way of thinking about how God relates to stuff is what we would call pantheism. So, just to recap, we've got three ways of thinking about how God relates to the world. One is that God stands above the world and apart from it. God looks down on the world and creates an immanent world to which God is transcendent. God is above and beyond. The second way of thinking about how God relates to the world is that God is actually kind of in the world and a part of it, a limited part of it maybe, or the gods are a part of the world. A third way of thinking is that God is actually identical to the world. This is what we call pantheism. Pan being all. That God is just the world. We're little parts of the world that have kind of popped up and have little sentient minds, but we're God, not like just apart from God. I think we might be able to recover our slide. Maybe not. Okay. Technology is not my friend today. Okay. Oh, there we go. I think I solved it. Okay, maybe we can edit this, edit this out of there. Okay, so, here we go, I got it. All right. Now let's see if this works here. Oh, yeah. So, I'm going to return to our story, and maybe I can fix it in a minute. So pantheism is another way of thinking about how God relates to the world. It's that God is a part of it, or no, God is all of it. Little parts of God are everything in the world. I'm a part of God, but so are you, and so is the chair and the room, the birds. Everything's a little aspect of God. God is the whole, the all. One way of thinking about this is monism, that God is just one. God is undifferentiated stuff, and whatever's come about in the world is just kind of like stuff that has developed out of God's being. In other words, you can't talk to God. Right? God's just everything. There's no will or necessarily a mind. It's just whatever's happened is God. And that's all. Everything is spiritual in the sense that it's a part of this big, long story. Another way of thinking of this is naturalistic pantheism. That God is kind of in the living world especially. like living things are especially a way to understand what God is like, who God is, and God is kind of like acting through the living world. God is the non-living world too, but there's something you can learn about, like something to God. There's something to relate to maybe in the natural world. Whenever you come across something living or in this developing natural world, and of course the definition of life can be quite broad. Is a star alive? It doesn't have a reproductive system necessarily, but it's doing something huge. There's a lot of energy transferring from one form to another within that star. So you can think of this in a broad sense, but God is a part of the process of life in some way. A lot of process theologians, and we'll get to this near the end of the semester, but process theology is a way of thinking about how God kind of comes to being through the development of the universe. As the universe changes and expands and grows, God learns and grows and expands too. And so this is part of why it seems like in the Bible God changes God's mind sometimes, or like God learns something. That God's actually involved in a relationship with the whole world, which is God's self. And God's growing and learning and changing. We play a role in that, or a part of that. So this is one way of thinking about Christian pantheism. There's another way of thinking about how God relates to the world. Not just that God is equivalent to the world on a one-to-one relationship, but that God has made the world within God's self. But God is also more than that too. So this is what we call panentheism. So the all is within God, but God's got more stuff out there that we still can try to relate to. All right, there's several theologians that have dealt with this. One of them, Paul Tillich, we might call as a panentheistic theologian. He talks about God as the ground of being. God is more than what you see in the world, but everything that's in the world comes about because God has made it possible. God is the ground of all being. Everything that arises that is comes from God in some way. Does that make sense? Okay, so well, maybe not, probably not. But, there's another theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, who talks about it like this: that classic theism says that God creates the universe, and they're two separate things. Moltmann says that in panentheism, there's God, and God kind of creates a little space within God to make the universe. So God is always dealing with something that's a part of God. We are all a part of God. The whole world is a part of God. But there is this space that's opened up. And Moltmann talks about it as space because some of the stuff that happens in the world, Moltmann says God doesn't like. God isn't quite like that. God has created some sort of freedom within God's self, within the universe, in order for things to make some choices that most of them are bad. so Moltmann talks about how God is trying to fix this problem that has emerged within God's self of giving us freedom, us being little God things. This is, again, complicated, difficult. We'll get to this later, but just to say this is another way of thinking how God relates to stuff. Okay, so for Christians, we approach this question primarily through the person of Jesus. Primarily because in our tradition, all of our sacred texts tell us, approach this through the person of Jesus. Paul talks about how that Jesus is kind of in all of the world. Everything comes together in Christ. The Gospels talk about how Christ is in some way God in flesh. This is especially the case in the Gospel of John. So again, we'll cover the New Testament in more detail later. But when we think about Jesus, we think about someone or something that has emerged in space and time and that bears God in a special way. So there's lots of questions that this opens up, though. How does God relate to Jesus, and the human part and the divine part of Jesus relate? We've spent last year talking Christology. So some of you may be like, oh, I know all this, but some of you may think, I don't remember any of this, that's fine. There's in classical Christian orthodoxy, that is the folks that came out of the Nicene meeting, the meeting of the Council of Nicaea, and the Council of Chalcedon, that was about 100 years later. Those folks who came out of the early Christian councils and deemed themselves, and others who believed like them, Orthodox. The folks who came up with the Nicene Creed, the kind of stuff that we say in church. Those folks came up with their own conception of Jesus. How does the human part and divine part of Jesus relate to each other? And they said there were two main errors to avoid. One is the monophysite error, or the one being, the one physis, the one stuff error. That Jesus is really divine, like Jesus is really God. Christ is really God. And Christ kind of like the God part, kind of like body snatched, or like there's a puppet. Jesus is a puppet, like a flesh puppet that like God has inhabited. and there's not really any human part to Jesus, right? Like, think about the invasion of the body snatchers. God snatched a brain and just kind of used this like body, and the body died, and then God was like, God, glad to be done with that. and then the resurrection is just kind of God leaving the body part of Jesus, right? So that's maybe uncharitable view of monophysitism. There are actually many monophysite Christians today, including Ethiopian Christian Church and so on, who have very complex and defensible understandings of how monophysite Christianity works. And in fact, they've come to an understanding with even the Rome over this, the Vatican, has kind of said, okay, we understand what you're saying now, we agree with it. So they're complicated in good ways of talking about this, but when early Christians talked about monophysite Christianity, they said it's like the invasion of body snatchers and that's bad. Okay. Another way of thinking about Jesus is that there's two different things. There's like a human Jesus, like me, and then there's like the God part. If you've ever seen The Last Temptation of Christ, like Scorsese's thing, there's like a little voice in Jesus' head. It's like, don't do that, whatever. And like the human Jesus is like, I'm scared. What do I do? That's a little bit like the Nestorian understanding, where there's two different people smushed into one body, the God one and the human one. So when Jesus doesn't know something in the Gospels, Jesus is like, where do I go? I don't know what to do right now. And someone's like, well, what's that? Jesus asks for directions. Like that's the human part of Jesus being an idiot loser. And like, the God part of Jesus is like, ha. You can imagine that, like, when Jesus shows weakness, when Jesus cries, like the God part of Jesus is like, I don't cry. Or when Jesus dies, the human part of Jesus dies, the God part of Jesus is like, I'm happy, I'm fine, no, I'm not hurt. So this is a way to preserve some understandings of God, that God can't be hurt, that God can't change, that God knows everything, right? Omniscience, omnipresence, impassibility, that means we can't suffer anything. It's a way to preserve some of those notions of God and put all that stuff in the human Jesus. But early Christians said, that makes us uncomfortable, because we think that God actually became human. And there was even a kind of a statement that was repeated again and again by early Christians: that which was not assumed cannot be saved. If God didn't really become human, then Jesus didn't really do much. For early Christians, this became a hugely influential idea, and even today, there are some Nestorian churches that exist, and like I said, monophysite churches that exist. They have all kind of ended up agreeing with that. Somehow God assumed humanity, but it happens in a way that works with their theology. Just to say that this has been an almost universally important idea for Christianity, that God actually had to become a real person in some real way. So for the Chalcedonian Christians, or the Nicene Christians, the Christians that become what we call Orthodox today, which encompasses all Protestants, all Catholics, all Eastern Christians, everyone agrees on this, except for some churches that you'll find, like I said, in Ethiopia, some churches in the Middle East that remain monophysite or Nestorian. But the vast majority of Christian churches will all say, okay, there's some divine nature that was in Christ, there's a human nature in Christ, and they kind of combine in a non-combined way into this one person. So God is Jesus. God is in Jesus. There's a human part of Jesus, and they are together, and they are not confused. But they're mixed. They're not mixed, but they're together, and they're not blended. It doesn't make any sense. It's a complete logical inversion. It's a paradox. And early Christians end up saying we're more happy with the paradox than we are trying to nail this down. Jesus is just fully human and fully divine, and they are not confused together, but they exist in perfect harmony. Ever got that? Yeah, makes a lot of sense, right? So what they end up saying is it's a super mystery, and we're not really sure. We have one other thing to think about, and that's how does this all relate to the Trinity, right? For Christians, God has three parts: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Creator, Sustainer, Redeemer, however you want to name those things. This Trinity, these three parts of God that relate to one another, now includes this human nature thing. For some early Christians, this is a problem. This is actually what early Christians would call a heretical diagram, right? So early Christians said, don't believe this. This is what's called the barnacle of God. God exists, and the human part kind of is this barnacle on the outside of it. Because Jesus became a human. So then, did humans become God? And some Christians say, nope. That's the barnacle part. It attached itself onto the Trinity, but it's kind of extraneous and bad. So, but Orthodox Christianity ends up saying, no, actually, humanity became God. This is the part that a lot of Protestant Christian churches don't actually deal with very much, but they all say they believe this, but they don't say they believe. They also will sometimes say, we don't actually believe this part. but it's in all their creeds. The human part of Jesus became God. It means that God is in some way human.
Did all of this give rise to people like you?
Well, I don't know, I guess. Yeah. I mean, so this is a tricky part of Christian theology, and so the divinization of humanity. But I'll tell you what, this wasn't tricky for early Christians. They loved this. And even in recent times, in the last 10 years, there's been a group of Lutheran theologians, the last people you'd imagine who would like this idea, who end up talking about, okay, divinization is huge, and they actually find it in Luther's writings. Like, even the early reformers who were like, their humans stink and they're awful, whatever, and human nature is totally irredeemably corrupted and it's awful, whatever, and God kind of makes it a little bit better through Jesus. Even the people who you'd imagine would be so upset about this, they all end up saying at some point, yeah, when God enters into humanity in Jesus Christ, humans become God. That's called divinization. And you may not have thought that was part of Christianity, but I tell you what, it is thoroughly, to the core. People become God. So,
and it didn't happen until Jesus? People weren't God before Jesus?
This is part of Christian theology, right? This is the question, right? So a lot of Christians end up saying, like Orthodox Christians say, yes, there was an event. The event of Jesus' incarnation happens. Now, in contemporary Christianity, there are several different people, so Paul Tillich being one of them, who end up saying, actually, maybe this was all around before, but Jesus is a distillation of this, or Jesus is a moment to show us that this has happened, or does that make sense? So there are other people who have said, actually, maybe this has always been the story. Jesus is a revelation of this truth that's always been a truth to us. But there are still, of course, many sort of classical Orthodox theologians who say, oh, no, I think actually something happened. I think there's good things to be said on both sides of that debate. I'm thinking of Jesus as a moment where something actually happened, has some, I think, theological teeth to it, but also the idea that, was God not in the world before? Also is a great question to raise. So we'll be struggling with that question all semester. Okay, some issues with the Christian incarnation include the scandals, or the scandal of particularity is the biggest one. This is a term used in Christian theology a lot. Some people really like this scandal. They love, oh, I love that this is an issue. And some people really actually are scandalized by this. The scandal of particularity is this. So you mean to tell me that God got involved in humanity in a man's body, in the ancient world, in a particular group of people, at a particular group in time? Does that mean that God didn't love everyone who wasn't part of that group? Does that mean that God didn't want to talk to everyone who wasn't part of that gender, part of that religious association, part of that socioeconomic class, right? Why did God become particularized in this body? It's a big scandal. It actually is a major question, right? And it leaves some people out, and it makes some people feel outside of the group that was reached out to, and so on. This is a huge issue, I think, in Christianity. Some people see this as a theological positive, though, right? If God's going to be involved in the world, it's better to not be involved in some kind of general way. It's better to become particularized. One way of thinking about this is, if God wants to communicate to humans, it's best to communicate through a human body. And why not just become one at one point in time? And take on all the particularities that a particular person would have. In other words, God knows what it's like to be just a person. So that particularity actually is one way to think about how God might be with humanity in a special way. Some people also point out that God didn't become a king in the story, a king. Like Jesus is a king, but Jesus is not like any king anyone's known, right? God became incarnate in the body of a person who was a poor person living at the edges of an empire, who had no claim to authority, religious authority, no lineage. Lineage goes back to David in the book of Matthew, but no one knew that, right? No one's like, this guy's awesome, a little poor carpenter's son living in the backwaters of an empire among the people who have been kicked around for thousands of years. It's probably not how you'd imagine that God would come, sort of enfleshed. So that's part of the scandal of particularity for some people who see this as a theological positive. But it is always an issue. The scandal of materiality. Did God really become stuff? Now, this is less of a problem today. People tend to not care so much about stuff, but for many people throughout Christian history, this has been a huge problem because stuff was associated with being dirty, or lesser, or degraded. Stuff falls apart. You all know this. When you build a house and you don't take care of it, what happens? It turns back to dirt, right? When you, when you plant a garden and you don't take care of it, it gets overgrown and you can't even tell that you did anything there, right? the world of stuff ends up decomposing, falling apart, being overgrown, returning to inert matter, right? So with the law of thermodynamics, if God is stuff, is God going to end up falling apart over time? So this is a big question for Christians, and today we might not care so much about this, but it actually poses some problems. Another one is the scandal of suffering. Can God really suffer? A lot of Christians would say that's fine today. Of course God suffers, God feels pain, but for a lot of Christians throughout history, this has been a big scandal. Can God really suffer? A lot of other philosophers from other religions would look at Christianity and say, your God is weak and poor, suffers, like it cries. Your God cries. Like, what a wimp God, whatever. So anyway, this has been a scandal over time, and actually does pose, I think, some interesting questions, at least for us to answer about God. Anyway, well, why would we have an incarnation? Okay. There are some big questions to be answered here. Well, the big issue for a lot of people is salvation. Why would God become involved in human flesh? Well, to save us. Because we need to save us. To save us from what? Well, from sin. What is sin? Well, disorder in the world, evil, disruption in relationship with God, and so on. There's a big answer to the question, what is sin? But that's not the only reason that people would imagine that God became in flesh in Jesus Christ. Okay, of course, the crucifixion being a part of that salvation story, God became in flesh so that God could bear the sins of the world. The New Testament also has some other reasons, and early Christian theologians have other reasons why God became in flesh, not just to save us through being on the cross through sin, but also to become a human, to actually become a human and talk to us and know what it's like to be a part of us. For a lot of Christians in the Christian tradition, the assumption of flesh, the incarnation, is salvation itself. And then the crucifixion of Jesus is something that happens because people hate Jesus, not because Jesus took on sins necessarily, etc. The sins of the world were born by Jesus because we're awful people and we killed him. But that didn't have to happen for salvation. So for a lot of Eastern Christians, the incarnation itself is God coming into a world and assuming flesh, and then God's power and love and truth radiates out through that, and the rest of the world is just catching up to what's happened. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's another way of thinking about salvation or God becoming part of the world. In this sense, the incarnation is not just God taking on human flesh, but God takes on matter. A lot of people call this the deep incarnation. Like that God actually becomes part of stuff, and all of stuff is affected by God becoming stuff. So this is like humans play a special role in this story, but humans are not it. The whole world is part of the story. Does that make sense? And then another way you can think about it is, this is a sort of third part of the salvation story, is that Jesus is incarnated with God, or God is incarnated in Jesus, because Jesus is a super special guy who just understood God in a way, a deeper, more strong way than anyone had ever understood God before. It's not that like the story of the virgin birth and so on, and this understanding of Christianity is a story that was added at some point, but really just Jesus was a guy who got it. So Friedrich Schleiermacher is a big name. He was a Christian theologian in the 18th century who was trying to respond to Christianity's cultural critics at the time, people who had learned a lot about science and history and so on. After the Enlightenment, this kind of philosophical rethinking about how the world came to be and what it was, thinking about ethics anew and religion anew. And after the time of Immanuel Kant, people started to think quite differently about how do we know things? How do I know things? So Friedrich Schleiermacher was someone who responded by saying, okay, well, you got some good points there. Christian orthodoxy doesn't answer some questions that have been opened up by recent philosophy, but so I'm going to approach Jesus historically. He was just a guy who got an understanding of what God was and how God worked in the world in a new way. And that was that God was love, and Jesus felt a presence of God in a way that no one had felt before, and to such a degree that he became God. So this is sort of a modern trend in theology. People like Paul Tillich would follow along this line of thought in slightly different ways, that God is the ground of being, and Jesus was just someone who got it in a way, in a rich, deep way, and got to transmit that message to us. That's the gospel. So there are several different ways we can think about the incarnation and how it works. Those are just a few ways to think about how the incarnation ties into salvation, or why would God become part of the world. We'll get to the question of what salvation is and what that looks like later, and especially in the spring semester when we talk about the resurrection. We'll talk about, so what does resurrection mean? How does it work? And why would God want to save, or what does salvation look like? Yeah.
Backing up just a sentence or two, you mentioned the theology of Jesus being one who really got it. And then and then he resurrects. So what does that mean about the resurrection? That kind of
Great. Yeah. So
minimizes.
So a lot of theologians who follow that line of thought. So Rudolf Bultmann is a Christian theologian who's also a New Testament scholar who says Jesus is a guy who got it in a place and time and got it in a way that no one else had gotten it before. And was the first one to translate this new understanding of who God was. They really got it right. And the resurrection is the way that we remember him in our community. That's what Rudolf Bultmann says. Paul Tillich would say resurrection is like a metaphor for how life continues on or something like that. A lot of Christians also would say resurrection is real and God's going to raise it. So like there's just a multitude of ways that question to respond to it. But I mean, pretty much any way you could imagine that responding to that, someone's done it. So these are just very broad categories that encompass a lot of people, a lot of points of view. But if that stimulates you to think about how resurrection works, I think that's good for now. Does that make sense? I mean, I could go on, but we're over time. Yeah. So again, there's many different ways to approach the incarnation. We're going to take a look at a lot of different ways throughout the semester. I'm not telling you there's one right way or one wrong way, especially in this Episcopal church where we just love you for showing up and joining us at the table. So we are a community of common prayer, not necessarily common theology. Does that make sense? So amen. Lord be with you. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.